It is excellent to see you all connecting with one another, since half of the point of this second half is to encourage you to do more of the same. I want to emphasize the power of repeated shots on goal. That metaphor means you're repeatedly trying to identify a new market opportunity, identify the customers that you think might like something, identify something that's worth doing as a venture, identify the theme for tonight's class, identify the people with whom you do the new venture. Joe said a few words about how we know each other from the very beginning of the MIT 100K Entrepreneurship Competition. Let me just say a few words about what brings me here and why this, I hope, will be relevant to you all. I've done a lot of things in the entrepreneurial arena over the past quarter century here at MIT. I came here originally 30 years ago to do undergrad studies in bioelectrical engineering from Silicon Valley, which I hated, Sprawl Valley. Ugh. I wanted to be here to do something different, and that was a hugely influential thing on the kind of ventures I've ultimately helped start. Plus, it's something that caused me to appreciate what things I lacked in getting new ventures going. And that's what I want to convey to you, because I've learned them. Coming here originally to do engineering inspired me to pay a lot of attention to the entrepreneurial arena, including running the entrepreneurship competition later. I entered it in the first year. As Joe pointed out, I had 8 entries, and none of them won. So I've done everything but win the competition. Then later went on to account for how many of your predecessors have gone and started and built companies. So today, it's the day job is teaching classes such as Media Ventures, which is offering to look at digital innovations. What are the new things that are bubbling up from the labs, and what might become the next generation newcos? When I landed here, this was a dream place. The fact that learning by doing is the ethos of the Institute, and there's all sorts of DIY activities available to us in the various makerspaces and more. This is amazing. It was me living the childhood all over again, only now with a little bit more formality and equations to give theoretical grounding to the synthesis and hands-on building that I was doing all the time. And I love this. My dream was to take this mens et manus ethos and combine it with something else that I really loved growing up as a kid, which is to say how I learned English. And in fact, one of the formative things in making me want to be an artist, an illustrator, a designer, cartoons. I first read them in Dutch, my native language, and then when my parents brought me here to the US, I read the same comics in English. So these, in fact, were instructional media, for me anyways, around language. I said, why not mash up these two interests? And that combination led to creating how-to cartoons. Now, I mention this story because, in fact, it wasn't just me. It was me having a conversation with a doctoral student at the Media Lab, Saul Griffith. Turns out he resonated with this a lot because he did the same thing growing up in Australia. He was making things and he loved comics. In fact, we both had in our libraries archives of old books that showed drawings and illustrations of what kids could do with the stuff all around them. We said, let's bring that into the modern era with digital cartoons. And by the way, let's use the everyday parts and materials that kids today have at their disposal. Wow, learning by doing. It's an educational media venture, and the important thing is it would never have happened had it not been for that informal conversation. Now, we're pretty good drawers, especially for technical things, but we're lousy when it comes to Marvel comic-style stuff. So it turns out we ended up using another powerful service, Elance, founded by an MIT alum. It's a way of finding people to do jobs, essentially gig economics. Nick Dragata came out of that process. He's the illustrator for these things. Wow, that trifecta. This was possible because of a team connection, and co-founding this venture happened because of that mix, because we had a perceived need, and kids love this stuff when they see it and get it. When I ran the competition, there were several different companies, I hope you recognize some of them, that came up during my time. Sensible Technologies, those of you who know Bill Aulette at the Trust Center, this was essentially his first scaled venture post his time as a Sloan Fellow. This was the winner of the 100K entrepreneurship competition when I was running it. The technical co-founder, by the way, the MIT engineer, he's now in Washington, D.C. as a representative from the state of Kentucky. That's Tom Massey. Active Impulse Systems was a doctoral student of chemistry who's now a professor here, multi-company entrepreneur, sold this business to Philips. NetGenesis, Brad Feld's first venture capital investment. This company was perhaps the first, maybe the second, it was certainly before Akamai, to be one of the publicly traded alumcos from this student-run competition. The team all met each other because they're fraternity brothers. Harmonix, two lab mates in Todd Mockover's Opera of the Future group, said, listen, all this stuff we're doing, building operas, and these enormous performances using music and machine technology, we want to democratize that. We want kids everywhere to be playing and making music. So the video game company Harmonix released Guitar Hero and Rock Band, all these other video games that were massively available to lots and lots of kids. And Mimeo, you're having this as your live case study. You see the Virtual Inc. business plan, what it was back in the beginning, sort of a parallel to the experience you're going through now. And in our closing session with Yonald, we see Yonald's overarching pathway, and he's going to reveal at a fine-grained level of detail things that are rarely visible elsewhere to young entrepreneurs. Silicon Spice, born out of Computer Science AI Lab by some master students who were in a lab together, sold for $1 billion to Broadcom, and that's when Ian Eslick decided to come back to school to finish his PhD. That's the way to go, if you can do it. Yeah. Well, what I was shocked by is how few people realized the entrepreneurial legacy that this place has. All the people who've graduated and gone on and built companies. These are just a bunch of the logos from the companies that MIT alums have made. What's shocking is how few people realize. A company like Campbell's Soup, John Dorrance, who founded that, was commercializing the flower of biotechnology from his day. He's a classmate to Alfred P. Sloan of Sloan School fame. Dorrance's Campbell's Soup canning and food preservation pioneered an entire industry. Ditto, Gillette, razors. King Gillette was a salesman, and that's a powerful thing. He sold bottle caps, and he had the gift of gab. He could talk Eskimos into buying ice cream. He, however, couldn't make, on an affordable basis, with high enough quality, the sharp blades that one needs to do safety razor. And that's where William Emery Nickerson came in, BU's Nickerson Field. He's MIT metallurgist alum. And I give you that example because it's the canonical tag team. Those who have outward promotion facing, an interest in engaging with customers and imagining new market needs, and those who can figure out how to make things operationally work, technically work, and so forth. That hacker and hustler combo is one way of thinking about who else you need to bring aboard your emergent team. That's a case example. All of these are instances of this. Now, we not only didn't have very good institutional knowledge about who those many anecdotal examples were, but we didn't actually have any sort of research sense of this. So that's what I did. After being a runner, an organizer of an entrepreneurship competition, after doing my studies as an undergrad engineer, I said, let me account for this. Let me do the first global census of all of our entrepreneurial alums and what have they gone on and built. Because after all, MIT and many research institutions are what their people go on to do. Right? That's where the reputation comes from. So let's put some bottom line numbers on it. 20 years ago, when I did the first census, those are the numbers we got. Thousands of firms employing 1 million plus employees with hundreds of billions of aggregate annual revenue. Now our colleagues at Sloan, Chuck Easley at Roberts, think we undercounted. They came back and come up with larger numbers more recently. Chuck's now gone become a professor at Stanford, he's doing these numbers for other schools. And this is a powerful thing. We here in this room represent many universities, either as students today or they are our alma maters. This kind of accounting matters, both from a pride point of view, that our graduates have gone and done something amazing in life, but also from a very practical fundraising point of view, because if you're going to go raise money, who do you chase after? The people who have it, yeah. So guess what paid the bills for this study? Indeed. However, I made a handful of what I think of as killer mistakes, because I did almost all of these things solo. Terrible experience. I mean, my personal inability to work with others was a real hindrance in doing this, either faster or better, or in having it spread and replicate. And it's this painful learning, the idea of not wanting to share my concepts with others before entering an entrepreneurship competition, not wanting to pitch an idea to peers and get their critical reaction. I mean, that was the bottleneck. And so what I'm hoping to do today is convince you to be the opposite of what I was, to not screw this up, to engage with other people on many levels in many ways. So I hope to motivate this agenda over the course of the next, half hour, 40 minutes or so, give you some sense of what's worth doing. And since it's nuts and bolts of new ventures, I want to give you tips, practical, actionable things, and what I do when faced with challenges. Joe yesterday spotlit this pyramid of the stuff that one should be thinking of. The bottom is really the stack of things that we're going to cover over the 8 or 9 nights, or sort of the 6 nights, but the 8 or 9 sessions that we have over the next few days. But notice, that chunk is all about people. People, team, etc. Yeah? You understand? This is a huge slice through what is necessary. So I want to talk about key founder connections, because this is perhaps the most important thing to get right. It's not just who starts something together, but who are the early people with them, who are those advising them, who are those they rope in over the course of time, who else upstream from you, that is to say, who are the people supplying you with stuff that you need to do your business, and who are those downstream from you, who are those who you're selling to or distributing through that you need, who are the complementers, the organizations whose operation you depend upon. For example, you want to do a chat commerce business, you need Facebook or some other player to provide the chat infrastructure, unless you're going to try to build all that up for yourself. There's the regulators that Rich spotlit in the case of Uber. Are you their enemy? Do you not talk to them? Or inverse, do you engage with them early and often so that when you come up with solutions, they're helping you figure out a solution that they're willing to accept, and you can also direct your own efforts to be aligned with what a regulator cares about. This is hugely important. Now, meeting founders is not easy because it's a trust issue. That's certainly the problem I had. I didn't know how to engage with people and figure out, are they trustworthy? This guy's example is not what you should follow, because it's incredibly unlikely. Drew Houston met on the basis of a simple email introduction over coffee in the student center with the person who ended up becoming his co-founder. They had a date and they got married really quickly. You understand? That's incredibly rare. It's usually a more difficult thing to engage with people. You work with them over some period of time. It's much more likely. For instance, these two are among the granddaddies of Silicon Valley. The man on the right is Bill Hewlett. The taller one is Dave Packard. Hewlett and Packard were undergrads at Stanford University. And after they graduated, Hewlett came here to do master's studies in electrical engineering. Turns out what he did for his thesis was a certain kind of signal generation system that, it turns out, a West Coast company started by an animator, Walt Disney, needed to do their next movie, Fantasia. And Hewlett and Packard figured this out. That was the genesis of creating what has become not just a consumer electronics giant, but an entity that has spun out many other things, including what's now called Broadcom++. Notice how they decided, they resolved a dispute. Is it Hewlett Company or Hewlett-Packard Company? Flip a coin. That's what they did. Now this dual combination is not the end of the story. It turns out there's a third member of this that was incredibly important. Fred Terman, the man on your right, was not only their professor back at Stanford, but Terman had an additional attitude that had to do with the building of the Santa Clara Valley technology economy. He realized that too many Stanford graduates were leaving the area to go to the east coast of the United States, to go elsewhere in the country for employment. But if he could encourage more of their graduates to stay in the Stanford area, well, that could be employment for graduates. He did this with encouragement. He did this with a little bit of money. And it wasn't just Hewlett and Packard. It was the Varian brothers, a whole slew of companies that Terman influenced. And he was also savvy about saying, let me encourage the use of real estate assets that the university had to be a home for that. This is a photograph of the intersection between El Camino and Page Mill Road. Stanford Industrial Park is what resulted. Now I point this out because Terman also had, just like Terman played a role for Hewlett and Packard being their mentor, Terman had a mentor, Vannevar Bush. Bush of Bush Building, Building 13 behind us here. Vannevar Bush was a Tufts alum. He and his undergrad roommate started Raytheon, which is today a defense electronics giant, still quartered here in greater Massachusetts. Raytheon, of course, comes up many times as a progenitor for all sorts of interesting new technology translation stories, including the creation of the microwave oven as a result of war research. But the point here is that Vannevar Bush later ran a chunk of MIT, created the patent and copyright policy. He's the one who encouraged companies to locate themselves next to campus in order to have close ties, because he realized the ties between businesses with real problems and academia would be another kind of interesting ideation catalyst. When Terman came to MIT for his studies, Bush was his mentor and advisor and suggested that he do the same thing when he took on his job out at Stanford. So you understand, MIT and Stanford, in this respect, are sister institutions. We're following a very similar playbook because of the personal and intellectual connections between these people. Now that continues. Another MIT alum, the guy in the middle, that's Shockley, together with Breton and Bardeen. Those are Nobel Prize winners in physics because they figured out something essential about semiconductors. Shockley was an entrepreneurial-minded guy. He ended up coming back home to Santa Clara Valley, started Shockley Semiconductors. Right? This is why there's silicon in Silicon Valley. It's because of his move. Now here's all that's left of Shockley Semiconductors. Parking lot, very near where Google X is. The important thing is Shockley was a terrible manager. He never learned the social graces. He never figured out how to rally people, motivate them, inspire them. He was a bit of a paranoid. In fact, he yelled and was just horrible as a person relating to others, right? Very bossy. And that inspired these traitorous 8 to leave Shockley Semiconductor, and with the funding of a East Coast camera entrepreneur, Sherman Fairchild, to start Fairchild Semiconductors. Now this is an amazing group. The guy in the middle, Bob Noyce, MIT alum, physicist. Guy on the left, Caltech alum, Gordon Moore. The rest, all great engineers, business and marketing-minded people. This is those who played critical roles in the growth of Silicon Valley. Kleiner from Kleiner Perkins is in that photograph. Right? In other words, the Fairchild spinoff from Shockley, which happened very quickly, begat a whole slew of what is our term fair children. Here's the genealogical chart. As you go outward from the middle, that's Fairchild, you go out over time. The company that stands out the most from this process, of course, is what Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce later did with Andy Grove, which is founding Intel. Talked earlier about Intel as a case example, Alumco. But this is just the Fairchildren. Intel itself has its own family tree. This is important. These are not spun out from universities or even corporate research labs. These are all companies whose pedigree is having been spun out from disaffected or somehow people who were employees at existing companies who felt limited, who felt they could do something better somewhere else. And that phenomenon is really important for you all to think of as well when it comes to recruiting your teammates. Some of the very best people, not necessarily those who are in school today. Some are, but not necessarily. You want to be broad-minded in your reach, including thinking about who's disaffected in existing organizations, including potentially people who you view today as your competitors. They actually may be ripe for a move. This is why talking to everybody, including competitors, is really a good idea. Now, the MIT landscape, just to give you an example of what it means to collaborate, sometimes it's not for a permanent or founding purpose. This group in the middle are the team that were on stage winning the $100,000 check from Vinod Khosla. But who's the team? Let's decompose. The three in the middle behind the check, plus Lindsay on your right, they moved to Nairobi to start this waste to value business. They're the founders from a narrow point of view. They are the actual ones who went and picked up and made a move. However, of the remaining four, Ella on the far left, she actually had another venture idea in mind, but partnered for the opportunity because there was a little extra money. There was budget for a trip to Kenya, which she wanted to start her jewelry business. She's now running the fastest growing craft sourcing venture in East Africa. The remaining guys were undergrads and a master's student who were still finishing their degree, but they wanted to help for the learning along the way. And this one image represents the spectrum of relationships you might have. The people who are serious, the people who are helpful, the people who are quite knowledgeable and could be co-founders but have their own things going on. To be friendly to those varieties of relationship really matter. And if you look at this stack of famous examples, it gives you a taste of where the founding relationship comes from. Amar Bose, Professor Bose, started the business with his first student, Sherwin Greenblatt, who now runs the venture mentoring service. Ray Stata and Matt Lorber were dorm mates at Baker Hall as undergrads and started Analog Devices, Stata of Stata Center. Digital Equipment were two lab mates at Lincoln Labs, Ken Olson and Harlan Anderson. That's Digital Equipment. Teradyne were two ROTC students, DeWolf and DeArbeloff, who sat next to each other because of alphabetical seating in the classroom at that time. They had time to chat about ideas and aspirations. Akamai was two Israeli buddies from the military, from the IDF, who were one at MBA, one a doctoral student in CSAIL. They said, hey, let's come together to do this crazy competition. Do you have any ideas? Yeah. Silicon Spice, students from a computer science AI lab. Gillette, I gave you that case example. AT&T, the Bell Lab system. Turns out Alexander Graham Bell was an audiologist at Boston University. And this is when MIT was still in Boston, across the river, that way. Bell went to Pickering's lab. Pickering was the head of the physics department. There wasn't even an electrical engineering department at MIT yet. Pickering helped him do the early instrumental equipment making that allowed Bell to validate his voice over wires hypothesis. That's the birth of the telecom sector. Main Street, running next to MIT, Kendall Square, is the original telecom alley. In a building that's now where Lab Central is located, is where Watson sat when making the first long-distance phone call to Bell sitting in downtown Boston. Right? This is all inspired by these loose ties, these connections. The VirtualLink Mimeo story is actually a powerful one because it's not merely lab mates, it's also people who were undergrads together. One who left and then came back for his MBA program. But that tie, the friendship from before, is what allowed them to have the conversation that begat creating this spin-off company. And then Mach 3, what's now called Everyscape, was born in one of these seats Mark O was a doctoral student out of CSAIL and met with Yonel Cherry, who was speaking, just like he'll be speaking next week, Thursday. And those two ended up having a conversation that led to Yonel's next business. You never know when serendipity strikes. You want to maximize your chance for it, and that is what I want to talk about today. Let's look at the big picture of the venturing process. Joe said, create and capture value. I would suggest to you that where many of you are now is imagining the possibility, conceiving of ways to create value. And you're either in the thick of committing to it, or you're considering, is the timing right? Am I legally ready? Do I have freedom to operate from employment agreements? Is the family, is the home front ready? The spouse, the kids, whoever else are people who count on you for whatever you're doing now? Have you thought through the business a bit? Have you done some modeling, imagination of what it might look like? Have you got some at least proto-team members who may be willing to think this through with you? It's the conceive and commit phase. And you escalate towards the creation of value. And that means things like the raising of essential dollars, the building of key prototypes, the engaging with customers in the ways that Bob Jones conveyed yesterday, and very importantly, selling. When we have our negotiation session, and when Bob comes back to talk about pitching, what you'll realize is that salesmanship, negotiation, presentation, these are all variations on a theme of conveying a concept and convincing others to part with something, their time, their money, whatever. That sales process, if done well with something worthwhile, allows you ultimately to capture value. Now, one way of capturing value in the narrow is having revenue with some profit. In some market sectors, revenue is not important. For those developing drugs, there's a long time of expenses before you have the capacity to capture revenue. But that doesn't mean that the organization is not valuable. So that's the second dimension that matters. What is the value of the organization that you're building? And sometimes that's a private market capitalization. So the fuzzy thing about people talking in terms of unicorns is that those are private market capitalizations. People don't yet know what the real value is. The real value is set by the most recent investors. In public markets, you have liquidity. That means that you have a mechanism for repeatedly and regularly setting the current value of the organization. That liquidity, through either public market status or through sale to another company, is the sort of, in some sense, the ultimate mechanism for capturing value. And I put on there a gift, because there are other ways to capture value. It's not necessarily for your own benefit, could be for purposes beyond. So for instance, to give you an illustration of this, and by the way, this doesn't end. This is a repeated game. Some people want to be serial entrepreneurs, do it again and again. Some people want to be advisors and helpers and investors in the next generation of entrepreneurs. So this is actually a repeated loop. Look at the MIT campus. Here we are. We zoom in on the chunk where the business end of MIT is. All the work happens in the labs. You see all these buildings and all those numbers. Turns out that all the buildings have names. This hall, for example, is called Huntington Hall, Bush Building, etc. Most of those are either famous academics or they're the names of technology and business entrepreneurs. In fact, these logos represent the source of wealth of the various buildings around us. If you see the tall green building, Earth, Atmosphere, Planetary Sciences, that's Cecil Green, co-founder, MIT alum, co-founder of Texas Instruments. Ray Stata Analog Devices, Stata Center. Koch Institute for Integrative Cancer Research, Frederick Koch, father of Charles Koch, the current leader of the business. The buildings that are just to the east of where we are, that direction outside, that's Eastman Labs, named after George Eastman. Every single one of those relationships was was created by a co-founder team and an engagement with alma mater. And this is not just here. This is a story at every university and college that has endowed or named or other things. So this is one of the ways that you might take this venture process and exercise the captured value. It's a way of or you might be like Richard Branson. buy an island. But let's not put the cart before the horse. How does this all happen? You need to connect with others. And what are the things that you need to do? Who are the people you need to connect with? Well, it's certainly the people you're building an organization with. Some of those may be temporary. It's people who are advisors, people who are up and downstream from you, potential customers. Rich pointed out that too few people are comfortable just calling up or somehow engaging with those who are potential customers or even potential competitors. And this is something that is not easy for many of us. Right? If you're not a sociable person, it really is work. And I'm suggesting that we're in an environment in our universities and in our relationships with universities, we're in an environment that is essentially ultra-friendly to you learning how to do this all better, how to present your ideas in front of an audience better, how to informally connect. And let me give you some suggestions on what I do and have learned how to do better. First of all, it's appreciate that you're surrounded by some potentially, well, certainly remarkable people, but potentially relevant to the things that you're thinking of doing. Sometimes we forget that. We're too busy, we're haggard, we're harassed by the pressures of the moment. And almost all of those people are, in turn, 1 or 2 degrees removed from others who you might want to get to know. So there's actually a real benefit to this sort of sociability, professional benefit, of course, and personal benefit. It's also the case that in order to get people to be willing to recommend others to you, they need to know something about you that matters, that makes you interesting. And so being willing to share your idea, or at least enough of your idea that motivates others, incredibly important, but hard to do if you think you have something super secret, want to keep it close to home. If you feel that way, I understand it, but I urge you to try to get over it. And one way to begin getting over it is to instead of sharing the nut of the idea, instead start talking about the problem that's worth solving. Right? You haven't given away your solution, you've just talked about the problem. And when you have that conversation about problem domains, people can get some sense of excitement about it. Like, wow, they may have a real solution to something that's huge. In fact, most people don't want to hear the details of how you're solving a problem, at least not in the beginning. They want to be motivated. They want to know why it's worth solving. And that's problem discussion. When people give you suggestions, be prepared to take notes. It's incredibly frustrating to urge somebody to reach out to potential contact, only for them later to write an email saying, hey, by the way, do you mind sending me an email reminding me of who you suggested I reach out to? In other words, be prepared for that relationship. And then follow up. And by the way, thank the people who recommended you reach out to somebody. Just that simple act alone is proof of progress over time. So those who you're connecting with and who are becoming your advisors or supporters are motivated by you having progress, by you demonstrating progress over time. That means listening to what they say. You may disagree with it, but at least you should execute upon the suggestion to the best of your abilities. And preparation means not coming up and pitching an idea without having done simple market research. Of the ideas presented so far, almost all of them have too many obvious near competitors that have been born either from labs around here or elsewhere in recent period. And that competitive market analysis was not evident. That they didn't even know that there were all these people out there. That kind of thing is not doing your homework. You need to be prepared and say, okay, here's what is happening now, and I think I have a differentiator. You have to emphasize that. Because anybody who's listening who has some knowledge is going to be incredibly skeptical if you demonstrate ignorance as the first thing out of the bat. That preparation matters. Now, here are some micro tips. All of us, even in a digital era, should have contact card. Now, I know a lot of students I'm engaging with go on and on about, well, I'm not in business yet. Why should I have a business card? Very true. Or, well, I have mobile. I can just do a quickie. I'll just ask for their email. Yeah, but that gets irritating fast to have to spell my difficult-to-spell name repeatedly. That's why just having something simple that you can take a picture of or have as a reminder, chronologically, incredibly important for you to accept as well as you to have ready to give out. This is still relevant even now. Elevator pitches, as you'll hear more from Bob Jones next week, lots of varieties and ways of doing it. The key, in my mind, is punchline first. Everybody would help themselves by giving the essentials quickly and then elaborating with enticing details. Instead of telling a long story and finally getting to the point of what you're doing, start with what you're doing and then elaborate with just enough information that it'll appeal to the person and entice them more. Now that's easy to say, hard to do. But you saw yesterday what a prepared or somebody who's done this repeatedly can ultimately achieve, right? The ability to listen to somebody else's idea and then repeat it back to them more coherently and more believably, having only heard it once. So the person who's presenting the idea, right, through practicing, trying it out in different combinations, different orders, you can get better and better at coming up with variations on your elevator pitch. If you're talking to a technical audience, emphasize the technical. If you're talking to people who are a generic audience, they're intelligent but ignorant, talk about the problem you're solving and why it's big and worth solving. You understand that ability to tune is a question of reading your audience. And that skill set, incredibly important, is part of the sales pitch. It's not just the pitch, it's also who it is that you're pitching to and thus what to emphasize. At various schmooze gatherings, you've got the place to connect with people. But many of us hate that. It's work to go to some gathering where you know nobody and to go up to some random person and discover they're somehow difficult to talk to and you want to get out of that conversation quickly. It's all awkwardness. Those of you who are sociable find this relatively easy, but that's not the majority of people. This is a thing that one gets better at by practicing, and there are some simple things to do. And most important is, wherever you are at some schmooze gathering, there's invariably somebody who's playing a host role. Talk to them, tell them what you're doing, and get them to make the introductions to the most relevant people in the room. That's the fastest way to get going in almost all cases. And a good host will be able, and you can become one yourself if you do this in turn, will be able to say the essence of why two different people ought to meet each other as part of their introduction. Like, by the way, you both have this common interest, or you're both in this arena now and you're thinking of something new in the following domain. And that assistive introduction is why the host's role is so incredibly important. They're a catalyst for connecting people who don't otherwise know each other. So take advantage of that phenomenon, take advantage of them in this way. One of the big failure modes is forgetting who somebody is. You saw them in a class a few years ago. Like, oh, who are you again? That's a weird thing to ask. Some people get over it and are just blunt and say, I don't remember who you are. But that's a kind of awkward thing to do. So the best way to resolve this is to find two people, one of whom you know and the other who you don't remember the name, and say, hey, do you two know each other? And wait for them to say each other's names. Like, yes, Carl, it's good to see you back. You understand? Even two people who you don't remember their name, you can pull this trick on. So, by the way, be a good respondent. Realize that most of the people who you may be interacting with, who've seen many, many folks, don't remember names all the time. So just be savvy about this and remind them who you are until they recognize you by name the next time you see them. In other words, you can be helpful in a way that allows everybody to save face. Now, a lot of times, a rising, up-and-coming person is asking a more experienced person for a favor. And the favor usually entails something like, can you write me an introduction? Or can you write me a letter of recommendation? That's sort of extreme end, but usually something like an introduction. Well, the more experienced person with lots of relationships is loath to make such an introduction lightly, unless they know more about who you are and what you're doing. So one way to handle this is to say, do you recommend, you are asking the person with connections, do you recommend I connect with them? Yes. Can I write them and CC you and say, hey, we talked, I recommended this. Perfect. That allows the person who's asking for the favor to write the note directly, but receive most of the social benefit of being introduced directly. Does that make sense? So instead of getting an introduction directly, you're making your own introduction, but you're CCing the person who has the reputational connection. That also allows a sidecar, a side channel conversation to happen between those two people. Say, oh yes, this person's amazing. That's reinforcing the relationship. Then, when you ask somebody to write an introductory email and they say, I'll write that introduction, don't leave it up to the person doing the introduction to make that email draft on their own. Draft it for them. Remind them of the essential things that make you interesting. Put it in your words so you know the message isn't muddled or mixed up by the person doing the introduction. It's not that they're ill-meaning, it's just we don't remember all the details that you remember about your own thing. Now finally, there's two little nuggets that are key here. Sometimes you want to get to a really important person, either in a business or in an academic context or other. They're ridiculously busy. Their mailboxes are overflowing. Their phone voicemail is ditto. Right? What you need to do is figure out who's in their direct hierarchy or direct social network or professional social network. So if it's a professor, it's who are the key postdocs and doctoral students, sometimes even smart masters and UROPs, are in a position to have an understanding about the lab because they've been there for a while. That's how you get to know who's who and who's doing what in a particular organization without having to go to the professor who's never going to respond or very unlikely to respond. There are a few exceptions to this, of course. Second, if you do write an introductory email, don't blather and go on about the obvious and not state the things that make you interesting to the person you're writing to. So if you have a background that differentiates you in some way, put that not just in the first paragraph, perhaps in the first sentence, and even hint at it in the subject line. This crafting of an initial engagement dramatically differentiates the circular file emails, which nobody responds to, and your chance of actually getting the response that you want. Even an initial engagement, an initial reaction is better than nothing. So asking or sending a complicated request is dramatically less likely to get you an answer than sending something that's tuned and pithy and attractive to the person you're asking for a favor from. Now, many of you are not just trying to find founders, but find teammates to escalate business. Where do you find them? Well, there's lots of powerful channels. I gave you the founder examples to illustrate just the sheer variety here. And our universities are powerful places for this kind of thing to happen. Just this place alone has hundreds of annual events and activities that are entrepreneur engaging. And the simplest way to get going on that are the various event pages and the key institutional places that do this stuff. And some of those are for those very early on in their activities. Some are for those who are far more experienced. Sometimes you play a volunteer role. For example, the entrepreneurs in residence have been at it already for a while. They're here temporarily until they figure out what's next for them. That's a particularly interesting category of people to tap into, whether it's in academia or in a venture capital firm or in other places where the equivalent exists. And similarly, you've got things that are highly personalized all the way up through the large engagements. MIT has spun out Engine, which is no longer part of the Institute, but is an incredibly important part of venture ecology here. Harvard and their iLab, Stanford and their StartX. The list goes on. BU, Tufts, Northeastern, the rest are increasingly getting their act together around supporting entrepreneurial action. If you look at higher resolution at this institution, one metaphor for thinking about how things are playing out here is going from ideation to large company. And there are many entities. In fact, it's overwhelmingly complicated sometimes to realize just how many of the different pieces are in this place and what to prioritize reaching out to. But one rough way of organizing is that there's those who support academics and research, sort of the formal top-down end of things. There's things in the middle that tend to emphasize some quasi-formal alumni engagement, staff engagement. And then there's the stuff at the bottom that's very grassroots. It's run by and for the students and alums. And oftentimes the bottom-up is more powerful than the top-down, at least in the beginning, because you get to meet a wider variety of people who can help you navigate this and prioritize your actions. Now, I give you this as the MIT case example, but I guarantee you every one of our alma mater or current institutions have variations on this theme. So the sooner you can build your own mental map of what your institution's equivalent to this is, the better off you are able to mine it. Now, it's not just organizations. It's also the classes that are taught. These action labs, that's the ethos of this place, is learn by doing, and that includes in the classroom. They're everything from the inventive end of things all the way through almost consulting gigs, where as a student, as a participant, you're engaging with established organizations. The stuff in the middle is the place of starting new ventures. These spotlit in red and green are the ones I co-teach out of the Media Lab. But there's a whole slew. We're part of a larger approach to learning by doing entrepreneurial things. This place is geographically chock full of goodness. There's at least $700 million worth of annual research volume in a university like this, several hundred individual faculty and small faculty groups that collectively, both science and engineering are 2/3 of MIT, and all 5 schools have research activities going on, including architecture and planning and humanities. So it's within these labs that some sort of diamonds in the rough exist. And oftentimes the most interesting ways to engage with them is how I played it out earlier. You don't go top down, you go bottom up. You figure out who's actually doing the work, who are the people who are publishing the stuff now, who are the doctoral students, who are especially the postdocs, the most underappreciated people in an academic organization. Who are they that may have ambitions to go start and build and grow companies? Well, the bottom up are the informal makerspaces. I just give one illustration of this. This is Miters, just up Mass Ave, right next to, below the museum. And this is a place where students build prototypes of their own hobbies. This is purely extracurricular. You do it in your spare time. What's compelling about this is that yes, it's a hobby. Yes, it's extracurricular free time. But it's also really serious. This is where Tim Anderson and Jim Brett hacked a inkjet printer, put water through the inkjet, sprayed water in a controlled fashion onto a layer, not of paper, but of sugar powder, did that repeatedly, one layer after the other, and made the first consumer 3D printer, printing candy. Now that idea was completely grassroots. The people working in the 3DP lab under Ellie Sachs, a professor, were thinking much more complicated thoughts. They were thinking about how to print hot melt glue into ceramic powder beds, a messy combination that was fraught with all sorts of difficulties and complications. This grassroots environment actually did it on a consumer affordable basis using off-the-shelf parts that were hacked and repurposed. And by the way, that happened again. That's exactly what Max Lebowski and Dave Craner did in starting Form Labs. They took off-the-shelf component parts sourced from other arenas and brought together yet another generation of desktop affordable 3D printing. Multiple companies born in these kind of informal makerspaces. Now, suppose you're not a hacker. This isn't your home. Well, what are alternative places to go? Probably the most powerful phenomenon of the last, especially 5 years, has been these ephemeral maker parties. Hackathons, makeathons, various names. The key point is, around a theme, people rally. It's at a hacking medicine event that Yechiel Engelbart, an MD who was in the MBA program, did his first prototype of an asthma inhaler that tweets. Turns out, an asthma inhaler that knows when you used it helps save thousands of children's lives, because when you forget to take your meds, things go bad quickly, and parents have no idea. This is huge. The company was just sold to Teva Pharmaceuticals. Many other examples of things, ideas born originally out of a hackathon. And it's not just the idea prototypes. What's more important is the people connecting with one another, getting to know each other a little bit better. No better place to get to know one another, but in an intentionally social environment. And it's not about the alcohol. It's about the discussing of a wide range of things, of personal aspirations, of hopes, of constraints, of what are people worried about. Right? because it's these non-obvious things. Everybody, of course, cares about cool ideas, and that's an important thing to discuss as well. But it's these additional things that are the make or break stuff of a relationship when things go wrong, when unexpected comes up. There's the obvious suite of digital tools. Every university has the equivalent of an alumni connection machine. Ours is Infinite Connection. It's not just the alumni, but also the current students. If you're thinking of doing a business in a geography, like say you want to go back to Brazil, you should know all of the alums who are now in Brazil, regardless of industry sector. You should know all of those who are from your particular department and program. You should know all of those who are younger and older. You should look at the titles, and while still in an institution, reach out to them so as to begin the relationship building. Instead of waiting until the last minute, when you need a favor, begin building those relationships today. And what does that mean? It means something as simple as saying, listen, I'm in the program here now, I'm thinking of returning and getting something started. I'd love to pick your brain about what works, what doesn't, get your tips and advice. If it's not a geography, you may care about an industry sector. There may be big companies in the sector that you want to disrupt, that you want to get into and do something new in. Well, those big company players are often either potential customers for what you're doing, or they may be dissatisfied with where they are now, and it's right, time is right for them to leave. So reaching out earlier is better than later, because you begin to build the relationship over time. You get to know each other, and they can then decide whether to spend more time, invest more time with you, and vice versa. Furthermore, there's the obvious mechanisms of putting a personal resume online or having a personal social presence, but you should really know your full digital profile, because they will Google you. And that means look at news stories written about you. To the extent that you can encourage positive stories is better than not so positive stories. Institutions today are far more willing to write stories about the discoveries and inventions that the students are making. This is a really powerful thing, because that then gives you credibility for when you, in turn, want to escalate and go from having invented something to taking it commercially. Also, you writing things, establishing your reputation as a thought leader, incredibly important. Some of the most useful things that my former students have done while here is not doing formal classes that were required, not even elective offerings, but rather the independent studies that allowed them to plumb a domain in a way that they think is interesting, to ultimately write something that they can publish and have reputational advantage, because they're the ones who've thought of this new concept. They're the ones who have gone to the effort of differentiating themselves, and you're searchable on that grounds. You then become treated as somebody who knows what they're talking about, because you do. You've done the research, you've published in a way that people can see this. Anyways, I highly urge you to make sure you understand what your digital profile looks like, including your own personal website if necessary. Geographically, we're an amazing epicenter of interesting action. The technology venture zone surrounding MIT's campus is at least several thousand companies strong, tens of thousands of people across multiple industry sectors. This is a supercluster of interesting businesses. The red dots, bio businesses. Those red dots, clean tech ventures in greater Boston Metro. Multiple sectors represented here. Fashion, design, the world of consulting, all born here. Do you realize the very first technology management consultancy ever was an MIT chemical engineering professor, Arthur D. Little, ADL. Right? Before there was McKinsey or BCG or Bain, it was ADL. And all of these have founding qualities in robotics and automation, AI, etc. My favorite supercluster is education. You can't see the gray outline too well, but that's Boston Metro. All the colored splotches are all the universities in our near neighborhood. I'm advocating you maximize your connections across all these institutions, whether you're a current student or an alumnus. The fact that you know somebody from another institution means you have a channel to better understanding the landscape of that institution. The fact that you have buddies from either high school or from earlier in college who are now elsewhere in this domain. This domain, by the way, there's 250,000+ people who are connected to educational institutions as undergrads or grad students or postdocs or key researchers. Like, this is an amazing talent pool that's just next door. It doesn't cost a flight to get engaged with them. We have an incredibly rich territory to tap into. Institutions like MIT have a global network of alumni who are part of entrepreneurial cohorts. This Enterprise Forum Network is just one example. The classes that we teach have people going around the world to start and build and grow their businesses. So if you want to do something in those areas, even if it's a totally different sector, you want to know the folks who are behind each of these ventures in all of these different geographies. These are all mineable. And the earlier you do this, the earlier you can take advantage of their recommendations, connections, suggestions, and so forth, especially given the growing volume of exploratory research funding, whether it's from Sandbox Fund or Legatum Seed Grant funding, or all the various sources of small money that allows you to go fly to a geography, do market research, engage with customers, figure out whether there's indeed something worth doing. That's all now increasingly available, certainly here, certainly in the biggest of our local universities. All right. One powerful way of connecting is to play or find people who will play the role that Terman played for Hewlett and Packard. Those are coaches, mentors, advisors, and so forth. When Apple was young, Steve Jobs, guy on the left, had a mentor. Turns out it was the much more vintage, seasoned Bob Noyce, the founder of Intel, earlier the founder of Fairchild. That was the mentor-advisee relationship that Jobs benefited from. Fast forward, there's the near-death Steve Jobs, right, in his later years when Apple was reborn, and it's the modern company, who's engaging as a mentor and advisor to a new generation. Right, now it's an outlier situation, but who's your equivalent? Right, we all, in our own ways, in our own circles, need to be proactive in developing this, not just for the startup that we're building, but for each of us as individuals. Having a personal board of advisors, having people who you can reach out to when things are difficult, not just when things are easy and everything is nice. It's when things are difficult. That's when you need to be able to reach out to people and say, hey, I'm stuck with this problem. Do I fire or not this person? Or do I decide to get a divorce or not from this relationship? Do I quit and do something new or not? Those kind of hard questions need people who you can have a confidential, private conversation with and hash out tough stuff. You can't only count on friend and family networks alone to provide this sort of thing. You need to reach out and build those relationships early because it doesn't happen instantaneously. When you have the problem, it's too late to be building up this informal board of advisors. The other phenomenon that's powerful to realize is that if you're desperate for money, it's absolutely the wrong time to be asking for it directly. Right? People can smell that. They understand that you're now in a very weak position. You're much better off on a proactive basis, instead asking for something else, like advice. Because oftentimes people who you ask advice from are those who also have investment capacity. You start talking to them about their advice may be, hey, you really need investment, and I am willing to make it in you because we've now engaged with each other over time. There's lots of formal counsel that you need to engage with. It turns out this is exactly the reason why people who are skeptical about entering business plan competitions, entrepreneurship competitions, should. Because it turns out that's one of the fastest track mechanisms of engaging with a wide variety of these professional service providers. You're not just stuck with any one of them. You get to taste and sample, through relationship building over time, several of them. See what the different firms are like. See what their different startup packages are like. Who gives you the best deal? Who is the most trustworthy? Who has the most senior people with their act together working with you versus the more junior people? The MIT Enterprise Forum Network is the same thing. Not just for MIT alumni. This is an institution that exists to support entrepreneurial communities broadly. It's not just graduates. That's why, classes like this are a case example. We're not limited only to MIT people. We want everybody to be entrepreneurial and to try to be supportive of that. MIT Venture Mentoring Service is a little bit more narrow. They say anybody who's MIT related. So if you're a staff or postdoc or faculty, that qualifies. If one of your teammates is an MIT person, that qualifies, which is another powerful reason for cross-institutional connection making. Now that landscape looks, all nice and rich and messy. You have to appreciate that you have to engage with many of these folks to get to know which one you personally and your organization most wants to engage with over time. How do you build the sort of concentric circles of team? Well, there's the obvious stuff that I don't even want to go into. What can they do? What are their professional skills and so forth? Those are the obvious things. The thing to be paying attention to for as early as possible is the ways that things go wrong. What are the red flags? And can you avoid them altogether by paying attention to those red flags? Put people in stressful situations. Create artificial deadlines so you see what your potential teammates are like under those stressful circumstances. That's why class exercises are so powerful, because it doesn't matter. In the final analysis, if things go all wrong in a 2-week class exercise, then you wipe your hands of it, you say lesson learned, and you do it again in another context. But actually incorporating and then finding out that you're doing something with the wrong person is orders of magnitude more painful. So there's shades and tiers of relationship and getting to know one another over time. So, not all of us are equally able to interview and assess personalities and styles and even skill sets of others. Most engineers, myself included, are lousy at understanding whether a salesman is actually a good salesman or a good theatrical performer. You understand? This is yet another reason for having that distributed network and a larger pool of people who are advisors, people who are expert in those different realms. You count on them to do the reality checking, to do the co-interviewing, to do it and give you extra, essentially validation, or the inverse, extra, something's wrong. You really ought to consider something else, or stress test them a little bit further. Call beyond the references people put on their resumes or give you. You want to know who are the people they're not talking about. What are the gaps in their resumes? What happened during those periods? Look for the red flags. And the earlier you do that, the more confident you then can be in working together going forward. A tactical thing, in entering things like Techstars or Mass Challenge or applying for grants and so forth, the people who you're doing things with are in fact quite important. The idea is important, the fact that there may be customers that care about what you're doing is important. The third of that trifecta is who you're doing it with. And too many of the several thousand executive summaries and venture plans I've seen so far in my career have underplayed the qualities of the individual players on the team. And oftentimes worse, they do things unwisely. Like there's people who they want as advisors, but they've forgotten to ask them. This has happened to me several times when I was sent an executive summary that I'm listed on as an advisor, and I didn't even know I was listed. This is a serious screw up. Right? I mean, it's a reputational disaster to do something like that. It's right up there as a stupid thing to do with plagiarizing, which, by the way, happened in at least 1 year of the MIT 100K. We're an entire red herring. The public offering for company A was copied and pasted and turned into an entry in the competition. Now, this doesn't get you kicked out of school, but it's a serious reputational hit for all the players involved. Do not do that. The connection-making equivalent is listing people as advisors who you haven't gotten their permission from. Now, choosing co-founders. This is, in many ways, very difficult, but the stress testing allows, that is to say, putting people under pressure or seeing how they behave under pressure, seeing if they live up to shared goals. Like in other words, if you both agree to do something and then one has excuses and bails out, these are early warning signals that something is going wrong. You've got the wrong person you're working with. On the other hand, sometimes those weaknesses emerge and you can live with them, just so long as you know about them and know about them with each other. And you've gone through the effort of discussing what it is that you're all trying to achieve. I want to give you some case example failure modes, because this is a painful thing, and perhaps through instances you can appreciate what they could have done to avoid it in the first place. The escalation of commitment that's possible from classroom experiences to extracurricular competitions to grant applications to ultimately things like Techstars and Mass Challenge, which are non-academic escalators for new venture ideas. These are all ways to do this kind of stress testing over time, pre-incorporation in many cases, before you're making a formal legal commitment. Now, one of the failure modes of current competitions here at Harvard, at Tufts, is the lawyers have gotten involved and they insist that you decide. If you get prize money, does it go to you as individuals, or does it go to some organization? If it goes to some organization, it means you have to be incorporated. If you're prematurely incorporating because of this artificial pressure, you may end up having founded a company with people who actually are not committed and serious. Right? And there are too many historical examples of this happening. Right? Of people somehow, something went wrong. It may not be their fault. Maybe they got sick or something else, and they're no longer actively involved, but they own half the shares. Yes, that's not good. It's exactly what happened between Bill Gates and Paul Allen. Allen was incredibly important in the early days of building Microsoft, but then got ill and had to extract himself from the company, which Gates, together with many others, ended up building. But that was a case of equal distribution. Those are a few examples of how people split the domain. Others, Professor Bose, Pat McGovern of McGovern Institute, they both either owned all or the vast majority of their companies. Keenan Sahin is famous for having owned everything and sold it for $3 billion, and all he gave his former employees was a basket of fruit as value props. Yeah, don't work for one of those. The mix. This is something we'll revisit several times over the course of next week. Tomorrow in our founders panel, as well as next week in the session on financing and the session on valuations. What are reasonable ratios? And Yonald certainly has his opinions. Lots of people have opinions about what are reasonable ratios for who owns what in an early team. I want to just point out two little nuggets. The status of co-founder matters to a lot of people. It's the reputational credibility of having been there at the beginning. In some ways, for many people, is more important than money or a stake. Why? Because they want their intellectual contribution acknowledged. They don't necessarily, because they appreciate they're not going to be there for the long run, but they want to be acknowledged for having been helpful at a key juncture. Advisors sometimes like this. Certainly early helper co-founders are like this. And then the second piece is the notion of vesting, which Joe will touch on tomorrow and will come up again in the financial section, which is that even co-founders should not own all of their fraction of their founder stake from the very beginning, that they too should be with the company for a reasonable period of time in order to accrue, to have all their shares vest to them. So these two little nuggets are important things to think about. And by the way, they're among the things that come up as disputes relatively early in the company's existence, because there are lots of ways to go wrong here. So it's in your interest to sort of have these and spotlight them, pay attention to them, try to avoid them. The most extreme examples of this are things like this couple, two partners in a venture. The guy on the left had started a business. The guy on the right had started a separate business. They had verbally agreed to combine forces. The guy on the left's business would be the remaining entity. The guy on the right thought that he was agreeing to an equal merger. The guy on the left never formalized this legally. And so what you see here in the text, and you can read it later at your leisure, is the resulting lawsuit, the deventure divorce between these two, when the guy who owned everything just in the end didn't want to live up to his promise. Right? This is disastrous to not have put it in writing early on. Here's a handful of examples from this classroom and from the MIT venture landscape. The classic phenomenon, especially among some engineering folks, is they're thinking that they own everything because it's their invention that enables the business in the first place, and nothing else really matters. The idea of organizing, fundraising, selling, growing, in all the things that's is not as important. And when you have that inflated self-opinion that you should own it all, that often means no one wants to work with you. This is too common, and thus the venture never happened. And Med Device Co. was a great idea. Winner of the entrepreneurship competition, floundered. Office good. Turns out a lot of people are uncomfortable with difficult professional, interpersonal conversations. The idea of firing somebody is not easy. It's not fun to do under any circumstances, but it's oftentimes better done earlier rather than later, because if it isn't done, these bad relationships fester and things just get worse, they don't get better. And so the firing of an early business person in a venture for non-performance allowed the rest of the team to ultimately be runner-up winner in the MIT 100K and again, alum from the class. Softbotics, 3 team members hadn't had the conversation about what are their respective goals in the building of a company. When it came time to sign the term sheet they had with a venture capitalist, one of the team members said, I don't want to do this. I want to build a different kind of company. I would suggest to you that's too late, right, for that kind of revelation, for them to not have discussed this earlier. It could be that the third party had mental problems, but that's not really what's going on. In sussing this out later, there were many early warning signals that the other 2 just didn't pay close enough attention to and follow up diligently enough. Chipko, one of the people who helped along the way, thought she had more to do with the ultimate funding round of the company that she decided not to join than they did. She sued them at a critical juncture of time when the venture capitalists were each considering whether to make an investment. And this lawsuit from out of the blue that they hadn't had a conversation about, an agreement about earlier, that's very unfortunate. Difficult to avoid that because it's more of a nuisance lawsuit. Had it actually been prosecuted in court, she probably would have lost. But because the timing was so tight, they paid her off. That's painful to have to do, and it could have been avoided with a clear-cut agreement so that there was no ambiguity later. Softpicks, the investor and one of the co-founders decided they had a different vision for the future of the company. They had a disagreement about business model, right? Was it going to be a product or a service? And used that disagreement to force out the CEO, which is an extremely difficult and unwise thing to do, if avoidable. Mission creep, especially if people are in disagreement about whether something is a social, nonprofit entity or it's a for-profit entity. This is increasingly happening when people are considering things that are of social benefit. Maybe a B corporation may have a special status in the law. It may be something where a company should be a hybrid. Part of it is nonprofit, part of it is for-profit. If there's ambiguity amongst the founders about this, this can lead to very painful conversations about whether what we're doing is for some sort of other good than maximizing valuation. The Winning Co case is a painful one because it's why the 100K has the rules it has now. MIT Entrepreneurship Competition insists people agree how the prize winnings are split because it was a verbal agreement between 3 team members that they were going to commit the prize money to a company that was broken later when one of the team members said, actually, I just want my third of the prize. Right? And that meant the lawyers got involved here, and thus new rules were written, complicating everybody's situation in the future. So this is a matter of having written agreements up front, if possible. Lots of unrealistic expectations and practices. The key thing here is conversation and documentation. You need a mechanism of resolving things. It could be a coin flip. In our own startup, we chose rock, paper, scissors as a way of resolving a dispute. 2 out of 3. Whoever, if you talk it through and you can't resolve, you have to have some mechanism. It could be a trusted third party, an advisor who both conflicted parties agree on. And when we have our negotiation role-playing game session next week, you'll be able to practice this with a live example, also drawn from the archives here, of actual people who had an actual team formation negotiation. So practicing this stuff, you'll be able to do it yourself. And this is something everybody ought to have practiced. Even those of you who's taken the key negotiation or influence classes in Sloan or HBS or one of our business schools, this is a worthwhile exercise to do with somebody who you don't already know and who complements your skills. So the last things I want to close on is that this stuff, all these tactical nuts and bolts of finding people, of getting to know them over time, of stress testing them, of seeing how they behave when things get difficult, seeing whether you can live with how they behave when things get difficult, that coming to know one another is about trust building. And it's also about building the culture of an organization. Right? There's additional reasons why Uber has difficulties. Right? Rich Kivel spotlighted a few of the outward-facing ones, regulatory and so forth. But there are a lot of Uber-own goals completely avoidable things about how the culture emerged over time and how that was tolerated for too long and how this is the programmer ethos is not necessarily a good thing to be allowing, and all the variations on that idea. So please realize that all these people decisions that you make from the very, very beginning really have consequence. Second, you all are in this classroom and you're in your various walks of life, whether in school or as an alum from your alma mater. You can, of course, be greedy and think only of what you need to accomplish next. And I understand that the pressures upon us are such that we all need to focus on ourselves in some sense. But we're also the stuff that is the actual social network and the support network that emerges from getting to know each other enough to be helpful, to tell two people who have similar interests that they ought to get to know each other. To, if you have a connection, say, hey, I'm happy to introduce you to so-and-so. To make the key links or make the nudges that you are in a unique position to do, given what you know, and be helpful to peers as paying it forward. You don't necessarily expect or necessarily have to expect financial return in the short run. But by having this favor banking playing out, right, what you do is begin adding to, in some sense, it's a karma capitalism. You're adding to a favor bank that will play out repeatedly over time, because this is not a single play game. This is a repeated game. Right? We're going to be engaging with each other over the course of time. Joe repeatedly mentions how past graduates come back and ask for either a tip or suggestion or a recommendation or an introduction. Right? It's a repeated game. What you invest in the relationships today bear fruit over time. And that is why tomorrow we are looking at the journey of several founders from different industry sectors, different backgrounds, different stages of experience, who've all, one way or another, wrestled with the full suite of issues that our 6 nights are covering, and most especially have dealt with the challenges of team building, recruiting, and organization building. Chaz comes out of the world of IT, built a venture born out of class experience. Jackie, on her second venture post-graduation in the health tech, medical devices arena, radically shifted her sector from drones to health. Habib was the founding employee of the company that was born in one of these seats here, and then went on to do entrepreneurial development in the MENA region. Now is back as an investor, but he's wearing the hat of entrepreneur tomorrow night. And then Owen Johnson, who started as an electrical engineer, and not only built an IT venture in the .communism era, but was a creator of an entrepreneurial ecology in Providence, Rhode Island. So essentially took what was happening here in Boston Metro and said, I want to be as helpful as possible to transplanting it in another part of the world. And today he's shifted gears quite radically. He runs a brewery, Revival Beers, which is, I would argue, quite different from what you see in a normal EECS research laboratory. Yeah, that's it. I hope this was at least a taste of stuff that's relevant for you. We can chat now. We'll have more time tomorrow and, of course, over the course of this coming week. I thank you all for your attention and interest.